Hello, welcome to Tales from the Green Benches, an oral history of Parliament, a new podcast from the History of Parliament Trust. I'm Emma Peplow and I'm Head of Contemporary History at the Trust.
And I'm Alexander Locke, historian and curator, and we're presenting this podcast together.
So in this first series, we're going to mine our vast treasure trove of oral history interviews with former MPs to examine life at Westminster through the words and the memories of the MPs themselves.
By weaving together these incredible clips, you're going to learn about life at Westminster as you've never heard it before.
We as children, of course, we couldn't follow what was going on, but we heard about it, we could feel it, we could sense it. And my father's political friends came in and you could sense all that kind of buzz.
My father ran down the stairs to tell her and she came out to tell him, and they were literally dancing up and down the path with great joy.
I grew up in a British patriotic and public service atmosphere. Serve the country, Queen and country.
I was a socialist by birth and background, whether elected or not, I think, basically. Until we moved to Wirral, and when I was 16, I don't think I'd ever met a Tory or seen one.
This week, we're going to be exploring our oral history archive of over 200 interviews now with former MPs, and we're going to be discussing why did they become involved in politics in the first place?
One of the things that strike us the most when interviewing politicians is how did they first become interested in politics? How did they choose their party? Where did they know where their political home was? And what drove these individuals to become an MP? I mean, they're big questions, isn't it? What drove them to think, I shall become a Member of Parliament?
So after discussing last time about the Westminster atmosphere, we now want going right back to the start of everyone's career and what led our MPs to Westminster. So we're talking a lot about family life, I guess. Alex, what was your family life like in politics? Did you talk about politics around the dining table?
Not so much. We mostly talked about history and bits and pieces like that. It's probably why I'm, a historian rather than a politician, though I don't know if anyone would select me. But I'm always in awe of the MPs that we interview and the steps they take and their engagement and personal ambitions to change the world through politics as members of Parliament. They don't just sit around talking about it, they're inspired to action.
Okay, so for our first clip is an interview it's one of my interviews, in fact, with the former Conservative MP, Olga Maitland, and she sat for Sutton and Cheam in between 92 and 97, and I interviewed her back in 2016, and she described very vividly some of her best childhood memories.
I was very influenced by my father. But the Overton Square life was intensely political. And in the evenings, it was a complete tradition, 6 o'clock. Ping of 6, with a clock which we now got upstairs. It's a Victorian clock. Out would come the drinks for the evening. It was generally whiskey. And then the conversation would start. And they would argue and toss issues around my parents with whoever was around until rather late. It used to be around about 8:39. But those evening swapping of ideas and drinks was really a big factor in our lives. And we as children, of course, we couldn't follow what was going on, but we heard about it, we could feel it, we could sense it. And my father's political friends came in and you could sense all that kind of buzz.
Wow, what a vivid description, isn't it? You're sort of almost there drinking whiskey with her and listening to the clock chime in the background. What a wonderful description. So who was her father? He seems sort of very well politically connected. No?
Yes, well, her father was an MP. He had a really exciting career. He was a journalist in the war and then went and did various other things. But he became an MP. And then after he lost his seat, he actually inherited the family title. He was the 17th Earl of Lauderdale and sat in the House of Lords from the late 60s onwards. So Olga had a very, very vivid experience of Parliament from all sides from very young age and talked very passionately and excitedly about her sort of background and like how great her parents were, but also they had this really cosmopolitan life with lots of people staying with them. And I think for a bit she had Donald Maclean staying with them, one of the Cambridge 5 spies who was staying with them for a bit, and she was describing that. So it's a really sort of insight into a very interesting household.
Very striking, isn't it? And a very privileged background, it sounds like, doesn't it? Very, very wealthy. Well, I mean, her dad is the Earl of Lauderdale after all. So politics is there very much in the house. It feels like something that it's not unusual for her growing up, is it? That perhaps making that step to becoming an MP perhaps developing ambitions to become an MP, to sit in Parliament, is not such a big step. Is that something that you sensed when interviewing her?
Oh, definitely. I think just politics permeated the household, and we get that. I don't think you necessarily had to have a privileged background either to have that in common with a lot of our interviews on all backgrounds. This idea that politics was normal was something I think happened in maybe over half of our interviews. You must have had it in some of yours where politics was just daily life.
Definitely. That's something I recognise very strongly, particularly with someone like Jonathan Aitken from a very similar background to Maitland in some ways. His father was a Conservative MP. His great uncle was Lord Beaverbrook, obviously sort of the great newspaper magnate. On his mother's side, she was the daughter of a quite a renowned diplomat. He was born in Ireland. Even Eamon de Valera went to his christening. So he's growing up there, sort of soaked in political culture. But it's not just wealthy elite MPs either that we're interviewing. I mean, even working class MPs often have strong families with strong trade union backgrounds and sort of organising politically within the family and within the constituency as well, aren't they?
Yeah, definitely. I think we have there's sort of a different category of between the MPs who came from families of MPs, and that's from both sides, and the sort of politics permeates their life completely. I mean, for example, Labour MP Lynn Golding, her father was Labour MP as well during the war, and she sort of describes the worry that her mother had when he was going up to London during the Blitz. On the other side, we have Emma Nicholson, who was a daughter of a Conservative MP and actually the niece to about 5 different other Conservative MPs. She described having Conservative MPs as all throughout her family and all different shades of the Conservative Party within it. And she actually is quite sad and poignant when she says during her interview that as a child she knew that her father's constituents came first, that she wasn't the focus of the family life, and she knew that early on. So this politics seemed to have been everywhere in these people's families.
Yeah, in a way, politics could trump family life, couldn't it? And we'll be talking a little bit more about this in a later episode about how being an MP could impact a family life. I was just thinking back to the interviews I've done with people like Harold Best, the Labour MP in Leeds. His dad was a committed member of the cooperative movement, and Sylvia Hill was very, very active member of the Labour Party. His family, were all very engaged sort of with socialist politics, and she was a member of the Young Socialist National Council, and even her sister went on to become an MP as well. So to some extent, making that leap when you're growing up in these environments is not such a big step, is it? I suppose imaginatively. Is that something that the interviews are suggesting, aren't they?
Absolutely. I think that it's just normal, that this is normal life to a lot of our interviewees, and it's just what they grew up doing. And even someone's like Parmjit Danda, who was a sort of the son of a working class immigrants, his mother was in the union, although he described being an MP as well out of his reach, but his household was still quite political. And I think that sort of, if the family was involved in Parliament or the local party or the union, and it sort of taught them to care about the political world and be involved in it and find it exciting and interesting. And this is a sort of, from a very early age, it comes through all the way through.
And one of the questions we ask in the interviews, don't we? We ask, what was the newspaper that you took? What was the household like? What was on the bookshelves? And often what the family's, the parents' interests is impacting what's being available to read, and what they're reading sort of enables them to come to a decision about the world and about the politics that they follow and they pursue.
Definitely. And I think, we have this across the party. So from a completely different background, our next clip is with the Scottish MP, Jim Sillars, who first sat for the Labour Party and then later stood for the Scottish National Party. And he was first in Parliament in the 70s and then went back during the late 1980s. And in this clip, he describes his sort of very first political memories of the 1945 and 51 elections and the sort of reactions of his family and his neighbours in this sort of block of council houses. I think he describes it as a 4 in a block council house where he lived with his parents. So this next clip is from his interview with Malcolm Petrie in 2015.
My earliest recollection, actually, in terms of politics, was the 1945 result. I knew something significant. I was just a child, but I knew something significant had happened because my father must have been listening to wireless, rushed down the stairs. We lived in what were known as 4 in a block council houses, and the 4 in a block opposite us, downstairs, was Mr. and Mrs. Logan. He was a miner. Mrs. Logan was a miner's wife. And it just so happened that my father ran down the stairs to tell her, and she came out to tell him, and they were literally dancing up and down the path with great joy. So obviously for me, this was very, very significant. My father remember sort of saying, this is, we're in at last sort of thing. After that, didn't really bother terribly much until the 51 election when Labour were defeated. And again, I just happened to be there in our kitchen with the old man, and he was in a dreadful state. And after listening to him about the disaster and the woes to come, I remember going out and was very surprised that the sun was still shining. And, I was Labour. I came from a Labour background. You just took it for granted you were on the Labour Party's side. The great hero of my old man was an Iron Bevan.
So, that's a completely different contrasting clip to Olga Maitland, a very different background, but still one that was full of the excitement and the potential of politics.
Yeah, I love that description of running down after the 51 election, and after hearing all his dad's woes, that the sun was still shining. Sometimes it can feel like that, kind of after a shock political moment. The sun still shines, the world still turns. Very funny. But it does show how powerfully felt political ideas, political aspirations were felt within his household, doesn't it?
Definitely. And I think that the mention of Nye Bevan, there's a few of the working class MPs that we talked to mention Nye Bevan as like the political hero in the household, the excitement of going to hear him speak at rallies, the sort of these great figures sort of be normal going to, I think we recently listened to our interview with Baroness Betty Boothroyd just after her death, and she describes going to hear Nye Bevan and that being one of the sort of exciting moments in her household's life. So it's it's something that politics is just normal. It's just part of their childhood.
Exactly, and it felt like he talks about Mr. and Mrs. Logan, they're miners, but there's this sort of great understanding of one's politics within one's community as well. So it's sort of very politically imbued household, but also a politically active and engaged community, which they share and almost take for granted. The views of their neighbours are the same as their own.
Yeah, I think so. And I think just that the fact that the households themselves were like intensely political places. Our interview with Anne Taylor, who went on to be the chief whip for the Labour Party, the first female chief whip for the Labour Party, in fact. But she sort of describes the sort of her father's involvement in the local party, how the local party agent was her hero and she desperately wanted to be like him. And that's why she went on to do politics at university, and sort of how she was called into the headmistress's office because the headmistress wanted the number of the Labour Party office, and of course Anne would know what the number of the office was, and she did. So this sort of idea that just it's completely normal to be growing up like that.
With a lot of the interviews that we conduct and that are in the archive, that there's this notion that even social lives are developed around the politics that people hold, that you'd go to political meetings, make friends, possibly even, develop, long-term relationships with people. Some of the interviews I've done with people like Michael Meadowcroft, who was Liberal MP, he decided to follow Liberal politics as a way to, to meet other like-minded people within the youth movements of the Liberal Party. So there's this notion that you're developing social relationships, engaging socially with people, with like-minded people, and that this sort of continues throughout their life, sort of beginning in the household and then stepping out further, and that the next steps to becoming an MP are not that far away.
No, definitely not. And I think they sort of these inherited these values that just you should be involved, that it was part of life to be involved, that you should care about democracy, you should care about activism in your communities and so on, and all this was important. And I think that sort of our next clip really gets into that. So it's the sort of idea of this, I think some of the older generation of our interviewees describe this as sort of public service, or we might call it a community activism or something like that. But the idea that you get involved and you do something and you give something back to your community. So this next one is from the interview with the Conservative MP Toby Jessel, who was interviewed back in 2013 by Anne Gulland. And he was MP back in the 1970s and he sat until 1997. So here he is, he's talking about his grandmother and what she expected from him, as sort of a family of quite privileged Jewish background.
She thought Jews from privileged families should give public service. When she heard I'd left the Navy, aged 17, she took down a photograph of me from a mantelpiece beside one of Queen Mary, banged it and put it in a drawer and never took it out again. And I heard about this. It upset me slightly. And when I failed to get into the Royal Academy of Music, I determined to get on with trying to do public service through politics. I grew up in a British patriotic and public service atmosphere. Serve the country, Queen and country.
So the notion of public service coming through very strongly there is a sense of shared responsibility and giving something back to the community.
But I think we get that. I mean, we get that in lots of different sort of contexts and lots of different language around this sort of value that's passed on in the home. So again, with one of my interviews with the Labour MP Hilary Armstrong, who went on to be another Labour chief whip, her father was an MP, but he was also a Methodist lay preacher, and that sort of Methodism and the idea of having responsibility and that you've got responsibility for other people and you need to give something back was something that she and her brothers were really sort of instilled in them from a young age.
Yes, from my interviews with someone like Harold Best, Labour MP, he describes that responsibility to his constituents and that taking on that responsibility, giving something back was sort of a very chief motivating factor for him entering politics, and developed from earlier trade unionist work as well, sort of a responsibility for those maybe without a voice that he could represent through his service in Parliament.
Well, we always ask about the religion in the background and what influence that had. And quite often, if people have a religious background, this is something that feeds into their politics. And again, this idea of giving something back. But it isn't just from a religious background. I think that you can have these values and these basic politics sort of put into your makeup, whether they're religious or not.
So you see this from all sorts of religious denominations then?
Yeah, I think so. I don't think there's any particular denominational background. I just think if there is a very strong religious belief in the family, it often accompanies this idea of a strong need to do something for the community and to give something back. And I guess there's also a kind of becomes a sort of wider sort of respect for democracy in a way that sort of we have quite a few people after the experience of the 1930s or the Second World War sort of discussing their family, telling them about the importance of democracy and the importance of fighting against totalitarianism, either on the sort of communist side or on the fascist side. So Eric Clark, for example, he went on to be the Labour MP for Midlothian in the 90s. He describes how his father sat him down during the war to say, you shouldn't go on about the Germans. It's not the Germans who are the problem, it's the Nazis who are a problem. And that was helped sort of really instill a value of democracy and why it was important to tolerate other people and other views.
Well, one of the first questions we ask MPs, isn't it, former MPs, is what their where their earliest memory is. And a lot of them, because of the age of the MPs that we're interviewing now, a lot of their earliest memories are generally sort of air raid sirens and of the Second World War as very young children, and undoubtedly that does impact on the way in which they perceive democracy, the fragility of democracy, and the threats that it can face, and in a way how impacts their service with it as MPs and their aspirations to find democratic solutions to major problems.
Yeah, definitely. I think Dennis Healey, who went on to be Chancellor of the Exchequer, told us quite grandly, really, I went into politics to stop a third world war. I think these experiences really resonated with a certain generation of MPs who sort of, sat in the House in the 70s, 80s and 90s.
Now, community also plays a large part, doesn't it, for these MPs? It's not just the household, it's about the people that they're mixing with socially, but also who the family are mixing with socially. I mean, you have working class MPs who are often volunteering with different people from different backgrounds and learning ways to cooperate and about shared ideas around politics.
So our next clip, I think, really gets to this, and it's one that resonates with me as it's about the sort of political culture of the Welsh valleys and the strong Labour political culture in the valleys, which is something I recognise from my own upbringing in South Wales. It's from Ted Rowlands, who was the Labour MP for Cardiff North and then Merthyr Tydfil from the 1960s all the way through to 2001. And this is his interview in 2012 with our former Director of the History of Parliament, Paul Seaward. Here he is talking about his community and his background.
Well, it was, frankly, the natural, I mean, I wasn't conscious of it in my very early years, but it was the natural political environment I was brought up in. I was a socialist by birth and background, whether I liked it or not, I think, basically. Until we moved to Rowlands when I was 16. I don't think I'd ever met a Tory or seen one.
This is an idea, I think, that I really recognise, that being Conservative was somehow considered a bit strange in some communities. We certainly hear it a lot from our Welsh interviewees. It's a very deep and sort of tribal feeling that was where you came from, and being Labour was part of your identity. I remember in one of my interviews with Ivor Richards, he grew up in the Welsh Valleys, but he was from a more middle-class background. He went to private school and he ended up going to Oxford. And he has this great bit where he's thinking about joining the Conservatives when he was in Oxford, and he turns up in this into the chair of the University Conservative Association, who had these rooms in Christchurch, and Ivor Richard describes them as palatial, and he just says, "Oh no, it's not for me, it's not for me." And it was really interesting because his accent actually got more Welsh when he was talking about this, and that's something I recognise I do myself as well when I'm talking about the rugby. And he sort of described it as this sort of osmotic legacy of growing up in the Welsh Valleys, and how he just really couldn't bring himself to join the Conservatives.
Yeah, it's interesting what Ted Rowlands is saying there, isn't he? Frankly, I mean, I wasn't conscious of it, but that it was the natural political environment that I was brought up with. I mean, that shines through for a lot of the Welsh MPs that I've interviewed, including someone like Kenneth Weech, whose father was a Welsh coal miner, very involved in union activity. And it was just the natural, unquestionable thing that you are Labour, and that, you know, without even a second thought. It's very striking in a lot of the interviews that we have, isn't it?
Yeah, and I think it's very strong in some of the Labour communities, but it also happens in sort of Conservative households and Liberal ones. I mean, so John Cockcroft described saying everybody knew he was a Liberal. And we also have John Watson, who went on to be a Conservative MP, saying that politics wasn't really discussed in his house, but that the family geese were all named after Labour politicians. So the most annoying goose was called Sir Stafford Cripps, and he didn't quite realise this until he was older, that why these annoying geese were named. His father had given them these particular names, and it's sort of this sort of natural way that these sort of values are being sort of taken on board by lots of different people. And I think there's a lot of them. They were expected to follow a certain path. So sort of Ted Rowlands saying there, like I was, socialist born and bred, or Jim Sillars saying you take it from granted, I was from the Labour Party. I think a lot of these sort of early experiences help really feed into people's politics. So we hear this really very strongly in our next clip, which is from an interview with Mildred Gordon. She became Labour MP for Bow and Poplar between 1987 and 1997, and she was interviewed by Richard Stowell in 2014. Gordon was quite a left-wing Labour MP, and she went on to represent the East End communities that she had grown up in. And in this clip, she's talking really about the problems that her whole communities faced during the 1920s and 1930s.
And the teacher talked about stories about buggy ride. I remember one little girl saying, "We've got those buggies at home." And my mother laughed when I told her this and explained, what the buggies were that she had at home. There were bugs in all the house.
Bugs.
Yeah. I remember my mother every week with a toothbrush and ammonia going through every crack in the springs of the bed, thoroughly making sure there was nothing there, because the houses were infested.
Well, that doesn't sound very nice, does it? Being nibbled away by bugs.
No, and I don't think, even though she was quite privileged in her community, I think she still grew up around that scenario, and it's not surprising that her politics were quite so left-wing, really, given that that's the environment she grew up in.
A working class background didn't necessarily sort of preclude you from joining the Conservatives. There are no hard and fast rules in this. I mean, someone like Elizabeth Peacock in the archive remembered her mother getting very angry, being taken for granted as a Labour councillor, when actually she was more sympathetic to Conservative political viewpoint, and being assumed to be on the side of Labour just because they grew up in a council house. So yeah. I mean, there are complications to this.
Oh, definitely. I think it seems I don't think that you had one way or the other. And it's funny that one of the ways that it really comes out in these sort of different values is in the school. And I mean, a lot of our MPs went to school at a point where they had to have the 11 plus, so they either had to go to grammar school or to the secondary modern, depending on whether they passed it. And that decision seems to have shaped the politics of an awful lot of our MPs. You either get the sort of the real people who have totally for the system, someone like Teddy Taylor, who saw his whole success and coming out of a working class background because of his grammar school background and thinking that was the way to help other sort of bright young children to come out through and to make the best of themselves. Or on the other hand, you get some more left-wing or some liberal views that say, well, why doesn't everyone else share this education? Why doesn't everyone else have these opportunities that I have? My friends back home are being left behind, and that turns them very, very strongly against the sort of grammar school system. So that's one of the ways in which it really, really comes out very clearly.
Yeah, that's stunning in some of the interviews I've done, where the 11 plus has had a long-lasting impact on the interviewee, particularly if they failed the 11 plus. It's something that stayed with them. And although they've gone on to have very successful careers and have become MPs and very successful parliamentary careers in Parliament, that failure of the 11 plus at such a young age has stayed with them and to some extent, impacted their attitudes towards education and towards their own politics and political identity. So it's quite a powerful thing, isn't it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, it seems to have shaped quite a lot of these lives and school itself is one of the ways in which a lot of our interviewees were sort of propelled into politics. So you have sort of debating societies or mock parliaments or various different things in schools, or it might be at university for those who went and sort of they'd get very involved in university politics or things on, or there'd be some specific issue that made someone actually take these values that they've grown up in and take these sort of things that have been bubbling around in their heads and their communities and turn them into actually active politics. So our next extract is from the Liberal MP Graham Tope, who was interviewed by Andrea Hertz back in 2018, and he in this clip is describing how the sort of his values and the sort of general attitudes and ideas that were floating around in the 1960s really propelled him to get involved.
The 60s was an interesting time in lots of ways, but a lot of the single issue groups, for want of a better term, by which I mean, currently Young Oxfam, Shelter was formed, the anti-apartheid movement was very strong, and I got involved in all of those. Mm-hmm. Actually, really before I got much involved with the Young Liberals, and it brought me to trying to look for I call a philosophy, if you like, but something that in a way encapsulated what it was all about, and that's what brought me into the Young Liberals.
So that was Graham Tope, and he was interviewed in 2018 by Andrea Hertz, and he was the Liberal MP back in the 1970s. And I think it's really interesting how we have all these values and this activism and this interest, but it actually takes some issue quite often for the MPs to actually join a party or get involved or become active. It's something bigger or some issue that comes up to make them join a party.
A lot of the MPs are sort of really, they've grown up in political households, but they're really spurred to action or really excited by the opportunity of political engagement by the experiences at university, often in Freshers' Week, where they go and join a political party or a range of political parties and find their political home that way.
Yes, I think we have a number of MPs who joined every political group they possibly could when they were at university and went to hear everything and decide from that experience which party they were going to get involved with. But that interest and that activism was there beforehand. And there's also, I guess, going back to Tope, this sort of the 60s and the ideas of the 60s seem to have been such a big part of a lot of it. So someone like the Labour MP Lynn Golding described the 1960s as sort of the general feeling that the world was wrong and it could be put right. And sort of these ideas floating around in the 60s meant that sort of getting involved was sort of the really natural thing to do.
In a way, it's the exuberance of youth, isn't it? Before they're battered down by constituency post and constituency work.
And for others, then it's like a specific personal experience or a particular issue that really pushes them to get involved and join a party. Mm-hmm. So we have someone like David Hinchcliffe, who we heard from in the last episode. His reason to get involved in the Labour Party was his father losing his job and how the impact that had on the family. Someone like Helen Jackson, another Labour MP, she got involved because of the state of maternity services, and she thought that was the way that she could change things. So it's a very sort of wide range of issues that really propel all this interest in these values into sort of active politicking.
And as Tope described, didn't he, the anti-apartheid movement and a lot of single issue politics that he described, prompting further political action.
Oh, you might have someone like a figure like Margaret Thatcher, who would either inspire people on the right to get involved and to join her sort of crusade against the unions in their eyes, or it might the sort of someone like Thatcher and the impact that her policies had on certain communities might inspire someone on the left to get involved in the different side. So these sort of big figures sort of take and these big issues get people motivated from both sides of the divide.
Do you think there's anything special about MPs? What makes them go the extra step, the extra mile to become MPs? To, we can all be upset with certain issues, but these guys actually go out, get selected, get elected, and then try and enact their ambitions.
I don't know. I think for a lot of the MPs, and especially the ones we've been talking about today, it's this family background of politics just being normal. And for a lot of us, we don't necessarily think of joining a party or getting involved. Perhaps it's a bit intimidating or a bit different, and we don't necessarily get involved and join. Whereas these guys, a lot of them have just grown up with it. It's normal. Their parents, uncles, whatever, are MPs or they're activists, and so that's the way that you change the world. You change the world through politics. And I think what they do all share is this value that politics is and democracy is worthwhile, and that's how you get things done.
So in this episode, we hope that we've been able to explore a little bit about why politicians became involved in politics in the first place, why they took that next step to become members of Parliament rather than just moan about politics in the pub like a lot of us do. It shows that the values that they held were deep-rooted, often developed within the family, and that they could be impacted by their community, by their jobs, by their engagement with politics at university and the people that they met there. But by and large, the families did impact them, and the opportunities that they had to engage with politics was perhaps much more of a commonplace within those sort of political families where their parents were unionists or MPs themselves, and this enabled them to take those next steps to become members of Parliament.
So we're going to finish with this really lovely clip from the later Labour MP, Frank Judd, who was interviewed by Rosa Gilbert back in 2012, one of our first interviews, in fact. And he was an MP back in the 60s and 70s, and here he describes how he got the political bug around his family's dining table.
One of the things that perhaps was very strong was that I have a brother and sister, but we had quite strong opinions, all of us. And it used to be quite a struggle to get the family together for Sunday lunch. We used to have tremendous discussions about politics and international affairs, and a lot of fun. My father was a very good raconteur too. A lot of fun, a lot of laughter, but a lot of really serious, hard talking and argument. But I just got captivated by this. So I'm really, if you'd like to say, a prisoner of my upbringing. Yes, absolutely.
What a lovely line, prisoner of my upbringing.
Can't we all, really? And so next time we're going to be talking about selection. So it's one thing to join a party and get involved, but how did they actually get chosen to stand for their party as a parliamentary candidate? And for many, surprisingly, this was the crucial moment in their career, even more so than election night itself. So join us next time for that one. Thank you for listening to Tales from the Green Benches from the History of Parliament. If you enjoyed this episode, please do leave us a review, follow and share with all of your friends. You can follow the History of Parliament on social media @HisParl.
These podcasts are written by ourselves and Priscilla Pivato. We want to thank our brilliant team at the History of Parliament, including all our wonderful volunteers and all the former MPs who gave up their time to be interviewed. You can find our archive at the British Library and references to all the clips we played today in the show notes.
To find out more about us, check out the History of Parliament's website, thehistoryofparliamentonline.org, or read our book, The Political Lives of Post-War British MPs, by myself and Priscilla Pivato.